Hello and welcome to the JD Power Travel Podcast. I'm Mike Taylor and Happy New Year. It's got to be a better year than the 2020. At least we're all expecting that. So, and as always, the three of us here will discuss travel topics. I'm joined by Andrea Stokes, who's our Director of Hospitality Studies. Hello, Andrea.
Hello.
And Jenny Corwin, who is one of our senior analysts in consumer insights. Hello, Jenny.
Hi, Mike. Hi, Andrea.
Well, yeah, it's nice to hear you guys again. Happy New Year! It's 2021, so let's roll. We've got a couple topics I think that we should discuss among ourselves. One of which I think is very controversial, whether or not there should be a travel vaccine or some kind of certification or digital certification for someone who says I've been actually taking the COVID-19 series or been completely immunized against COVID-19, and therefore I should be able to travel wherever and whenever I want. And I do see some value in that, from my opinion, and some items that give me a little bit of pause. But I thought I'd first start with Andrea. And Andrea, what is your opinion of this? Is this a good idea, a bad idea?
I think it's, probably, whether it's good or bad, it's the reality. And I do think there will be some kind of um, card or some way to keep track of travelers' vaccinations, especially for international travel. I'm not quite sure for domestic travel within the US if it will, play out. But, in regard to traveling to other countries, and traveling across countries, I think it's probably there's going to be something in place. It's just a question of when, that, whether this is managed by airlines, whether this is managed through when you apply for a visa to travel to a country, it's the administration of it that I think is going to be really difficult. But if certain countries can get this in place, I do think travelers internationally will face something like this.
All right, and Jenny, what do you think? Good idea, bad idea?
I struggle with both of those options, good or bad. It is what it is. Like Andrea said, I think that I feel like the implementation just thinking about the complexity of how we get to that point is very difficult for me to even wrap my head around. I see that for international travel, I think it does make sense. It's probably easier to implement there because you have visas and passports, and there's already other things that are required. In some countries, you do have to have certain vaccinations to visit as it is. So adding on to that is one thing. But for domestic travel, or you've even seen it for theme parks, or for certain attractions are saying they might require something like that, and that just seems like the enforcement would be quite a challenge. And then there's just other issues with in general vaccine distribution, and how long do you want to limit the travel based on the ability of people not to get the vaccine, and when is enough, and how long do we do this? And we don't know how long the vaccine really works for at this point. So is this an annual thing like a flu shot? There's just a lot of unknowns right now. So it's hard to say whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. I think it's going to be a challenge, though, either way.
I was going to mention the cruise industry, and I do think the cruise industry is probably one sector of travel, especially domestic travel in the US, that where vaccination, some proof of vaccination probably will be required. It may not be required, to fly, but when you take a cruise, there is quite a bit of information, that you do have to provide. And so I guess that affects, international cruising to, international locations as well. But I just wanted to jump in and talk a little bit about the cruise industry, given how that industry has been particularly devastated, and in fact there are no cruises going on at all right now. So I just wanted to mention that I think something like this it's going to be required for cruises.
Yeah, and for my part, I'd like to see this not happen. I think it's still an impediment to travel. I think that when we give, everybody gives the analogy, or some people give the analogy of you have to have inoculation records to go to certain parts of, say, Africa or something. And I don't think that's really analogous, because that's usually very localized outbreaks. I think that the virus COVID-19 has reached all continents, including Antarctica now. So there really isn't. You're not traveling to any particular area that is completely devoid of the virus. But I do see people want to having some reassurance to it. But it does kind of smack to me of of papers, please. And we all were. I think part of this lockdown, at least from my perspective, is that we all look askance at each other, and I think it creates a lot of stress. Now, Jenny, your points about the vaccine, whether it lasts a long time, are very valid. Because we rolled out this vaccine so quickly, which is great, modern medical miracle and all that. But when you do have these long time frames for tests in vivo and with live people, you kind of have a much better idea of how long they last. These things usually last. These trials last for several years, not just several months like this one has. So we are going to have go through some learning process. But I wouldn't want to make a decision based on the lack of information. And that's the part that bothers me the most, is we don't really know exactly if this would help us all at all in the travel industry, or facilitating international commerce or international travel. So there are a lot of unknowns. I'd prefer to see it not happen, just as my own personal opinion, because I think it's going to be difficult to enforce. I think there'll be a lot of problems with it. I think it could be easily faked. I mean, how do you know someone's actually been injected, and who becomes the authority, and what's the cost of that? And then it's also an added burden on the airlines and the cruise industry to make sure that all these passengers have it. And what's the liability there? We live in the litigious society of the United States, and that also does bother me as well. Are there any other thoughts on this before we move on to the next topic?
I think this is an interesting question too, when we think about the recovery of business travel, and whether corporations will require employees to be vaccinated perhaps before they allow them to take business trips. That's the question, right? And what will companies put in place, right? So they feel that the risk is minimized for their employees to take business trips. For me, if it helps the business travel sector recover, I think we should do everything we can do to bring back business travel.
Well, I know that, Andrea, you and I were talking, I think it was earlier today, about the incidence level of business travel that we see. And in the studies that we've been doing on airport with our product Passenger View, which is a product where we use people's logins on their smartphones or on their laptops. When they log onto the Wi-Fi, they get an opportunity to take a very short survey from J.D. Power. And we found the incidence to be around 20% for business travel. And that's probably 2/3, 65% of what we normally see in an airport. And I think that, Andrea, I believe you told me that you had also seen 20% in your hotel study, which is also down from its normal level.
That's
Is that
right.
correct?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So and I do hear from airports, which is extraordinarily logical, that they're not seeing business people traveling, and they're not using the kinds of services they normally would. And some of those services simply aren't being offered, such as valet parking, for example. You don't want someone to get into your car, or the valet parker doesn't want to get into someone's car and drive it onto a lot, things like that. So Our next topic is also COVID-19 related, which I would love to hear Andrea's position on whether hotels should be a vaccination site. Because again, here what we've seen in the various states where we use the states as petri dishes to see what works and what doesn't work, and we see that there are certain states like Florida where they're distributing the vaccine at grocery stores, at large chain. I think Publix is one of them, grocery stores. But Andrea, do you think it's a good idea for hotels to become a vaccination site for COVID-19?
Well, I think hotels have offered this. I've been hearing that given the pace at which vaccinations need to ramp up to get this done quickly, and given the new administration with the goal of I think it was 100 million vaccinations within 100 days. They're going to need every resource that's available, right? And yeah, I do. I do not think this can be done just relying on your local pharmacy or your local grocery store. I think there are going to have to be multiple vaccination sites around in every city, in every local area, and hotels certainly, some of them, have meeting and convention space, right? That's not being used right now. Very, very large spaces, in fact, that could be used in this way, where and you could really have a large number of people going through these very large meeting spaces as vaccination sites, right? So I think, again, if hotels are willing to offer this, I think, again, every resource needs to be put to the effort if truly we are going to get everyone vaccinated quickly.
And Jenny, do you have any views on this topic?
Yeah, I think for me the biggest thing is location, right? I think the biggest challenge we're hearing about vaccine distribution is going to be in some of those hard to reach areas. And so if there is a hotel with the space, it makes sense. But I feel like that's not generally where you're going to find a lot of the hotels with the large meeting and event spaces is in really rural areas. Where you may not even have a Walgreens or a CVS or whatever the local pharmacy. So uh, that's the challenge to me. I think it's great that hotels are looking to use their spaces to help the communities. I think that's great, but I just don't know how that's going to help get everybody that we need to get, I guess. And then there's the storage concerns too, like making sure they have the facilities available to store the vaccine, at the very very cold temperatures it needs to be in order to be distributed. So I think it would be a challenge, but I do think there are probably some city locations and maybe some even suburban locations where this would be a really effective way to get the vaccine out to more people who want it.
Yeah, and I think that hotels have every incentive to get this uh, epidemic over with finally. So I think it's a good idea. I see some of the practicalities that you guys have mentioned. Storage and as my wife who has been vaccinated, she's very sensitive to vaccines, and I was very fearful that she would have some anaphylactic shock, which she did not. She didn't feel very well for 2 days after this first round. But it wasn't as bad as some of the other vaccinations she's had. So you need to have, you just can't show up and put a folding table up and then start, jabbing people's arms with hypodermics. There's some things for this particular vaccine that you need a little bit more backup, a little bit more support as well. And I thought, well, thanks very much, Jenny and Andrea. You gave me some things to think about. I hadn't some of those things you had mentioned. I hadn't really thought of before. So I wanted to finish actually with one of the questions I get very often as someone who helps run the rental car study at JD Power is, gee, how can Hertz be doing so well in your study? They've won the last 2 years in a row. They've won the J.D. Power Award when they're bankrupt. And I've actually got that question on several occasions in the travel space because in the past I have very fond memories of handing the trophy to the old TWA airline when it was based out of St. Louis at the time they were bankrupt. And so we haven't really talked about Hertz's bankruptcy. It's one of the larger bankruptcies in the U.S. history. And where do they go from here? And to answer that first part of my own question, or what question that people put to me, is there's not really a strong one-to-one relationship between the financial position of a company, whether or not they have the financing and the assets to make themselves solvent, and how they treat the customer. Generally, I find them, at least in our studies that I've done over the last 20 some years at JD Power, I haven't seen much of a correlation between bankruptcy or financial position and customer service. So there is, however, during this pandemic, a real kind of hit or miss. Hertz is in a position now where it needs to close some of its smaller locations because they just can't make it work. Most notably, I think the most recent ones have been there. I think they've closed 3 locations in Wyoming at very small airports, obviously. So to concentrate on those airports where they can have better cash flow and preserve their cash as well. So it is having some effect in smaller marketplaces where you're not getting that same kind of choice. There still are, of course, other rental car companies you can patronize, but if you're a Hertz loyal member and you like that Hertz service, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to find in smaller markets. And that's probably the biggest impact that I've seen of the Hertz bankruptcy, is that it's only in certain markets where it's greatly affected. It's kind of either or. Either you have it or you don't have it. So, but they've got to preserve themselves and get themselves back into a position where they can be solvent again. So, Jenny, do you have any thoughts or observations in the data that you've seen or reactions you've seen between financial solvency and customer satisfaction?
Well, I mean, I would say solvency. No, I generally we do see there's usually a positive correlation between customer satisfaction and customer retention. But there's a lot of things that go into making having a lot of customers or retaining customers financially profitable as well. So I think it's important to remember that satisfaction is generally a big piece of profitability if you use it correctly. That's not. I mean, obviously, there's some other issues going on with Hertz that has led them to this bankruptcy, but for the last couple of years, it doesn't seem to have affected their customer experience exactly. So.
And Andrea, what about hospitality and hotels? We do see hotel chains go in and out of business on a quite frequent basis. And how does that look in JD Power studies and other things that you've seen in your years in the hospitality industry?
Yeah, I think hospitality generally, faces mergers. Not, I don't recall a recent large bankruptcy, but of course, we've had recent very large mergers. And often when mergers happen, right, there's a company that's acquiring the customers of another company. And, in some cases, right, those customers may not be as happy. They're, now perhaps facing a new experience, a new loyalty program. They're being merged into a new loyalty program, right? And I think this has happened in airlines too, where, those customers feel like they're, perhaps getting less, right? Getting a little bit less than they used to get in terms of benefits of being a loyal customer to the brand. So that's where we have seen impacts on, customer satisfaction generally in hospitality.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good place to stop on our first podcast of 2021. And I want to thank, as always, Andrea Stokes, who leads our hospitality group at JD Power, and Jenny Corwin, who's a senior manager in our consumer insights. I'd also like to thank Dan Sharp, who's our producer and very patient with us all and our crazy schedules that we have. and also Kelly Shea, who puts all this stuff together and keeps us all on the same page. So if you'd like to learn more about JD Power, especially in our travel group, you can go to jdpower.com/business or click in the upper right-hand corner where it says business, and you'll see the travel tile. Click on that. You'll see a lot of interesting things that we're doing. And it's a great place. It's a great website to wander around because there's an awful lot of information and about other topics that impact not only the travel industry, but the economy of the world in general. So thanks again for listening, and we will see you next month in February of 2021.